The United Nations has urged corporates to use their business chains to help implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi, the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, was speaking in Nairobi earlier, and he said the SDGs present an opportunity for business-led solutions and economic opportunities. Kituyi has pointed out the SDGs consist of an estimated investment of $2 to $3 trillion a year. Now, the SDGs are a set of 17 goals that set the world's development agenda and measure its progress. And joining me in the studio with more on this is Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi. He's the Secretary General, of course, of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kituyi.
Well, thank you very much for
having me. Of course, I want to start with the discussions around the SDGs. A lot of discussion and skepticism around how these global goals will build on the progress, of course, of the MDGs. It seems like this time around you're looking at the private sector to sort of help you or achieve that goal or to drive the success of these SDGs. Give me some insight into what your strategy is this time around.
All right. One of the main lessons we draw from the Millennium Development Goals was that success in reaching social goals was most realized in countries which invested in economic empowerment. Leading example being China. And therefore, the successor to MDGs, what we're calling the Sustainable Development Goals, says give economic empowerment as an enabler for realizing human quality improvement.
Right.
And you cannot empower people economically without the intervention of the private sector. Not least because states, particularly in the developing world, do not have the capacity, the resources on their own to create the infrastructure and opportunities for empowering livelihoods.
Right.
And that's why we're talking about a partnership between the private sector and governments. Secondly, we all agree that since private sector are major drivers of public enterprise, of public activity today, it's critically important that they internalize the principles of sustainable development goals in their practices. For example, how many women do they have in management? How are they exercising opportunities for women empowerment? How do they create conditions that strengthen communities in which they make their profits? That narrative is impossible without a partnership involving the management and the players within the private sector.
Right. Now, I know UNCTAD released a report, the Development in Africa report, and in that report you said at least $600 billion will be needed each year to achieve the SDGs in Africa. Now, of course, against the backdrop of the current global financial system, has there been any appetite, not just from the governments, but also from the private sector as well, to fund these SDG projects? Have you seen it affect the interest and the appetite?
I mean, there are no projects that stand on their own that are called SDG projects as such, but a lot of investment is into infrastructure that enables, into activities that realize the aspirations of the global goals. Now, we all know that there is an acute deficit in public financing. For example, to realize the promises of inclusive prosperity by 2030, Africa needs $93 billion every year in infrastructure investment. There's a deficit of about 53% of $53 billion of that amount. Where does it come from? FDI, public-private partnerships. And it has to be smart partnerships. So our responsibility at this conference next week is to say, how can we demonstrate partnerships that have worked? How can we identify problems that have to be avoided? How can we scale up success stories? How can we start translating promise into action? That's why, as the first international organization, United Nations meeting, since the SDG agreement of September last year, UNCTAD Nairobi is an opportunity to move world discourse from promises to actions.
Right. And I mean, like you mentioned, the conference does start on Sunday, actually, UNCTAD 14. Yeah. Now, your theme will be inclusive and equitable global economic environment for trade and development. Give me some insight into what sort of outcome you're hoping for this time around, because we do have a lot of conferences discussing similar things on the continent. What are the
unique
outcomes?
thing about our meeting is this is not a talk shop. First of all, I have a World Investment Forum The last investment forum I held of a similar nature in Geneva realized $14 billion of transactions. And we're hoping in Nairobi, fund managers, sovereign fund managers, impact investors, and partners, governments and enterprises from the developing world will seal deals that are worth more than $14 billion in the course of next week. Secondly, for the first time, we are involving a youth forum for youth as key stakeholders in Agenda 2030 to be players in how public resources are directed in a pursuit of their inclusive prosperity. And number three, we have called upon the different players in Nairobi to agree on major changes in the regime of investment agreements to reduce the vulnerability of developing countries to international corporations. We're talking about principles on managing investment to reduce tax evasion and profit shifting, which is robbing Africa more than FDI inflows. These are concrete issues for concrete challenges that can make a direct impact on Africa.
Well, we'll certainly be there following the discussions as they start on Sunday. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi, he's the Secretary General, of course, of UNCTAD.